All right, welcome back. Lesson 2. So I'm not gonna belabor the genealogies that are given in the gospel messages. We talked about the 4 gospel writers last class, and we talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the different approaches, the different audience, the different kind of people that they were, the details given, and those kinds of things. There are 2 of those writers who give us genealogies that bring us to Jesus. Matthew and Luke. They are the 2 who provide us with genealogies. We're going to quickly look over these genealogies. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, only because it just gets so long and you can get so bogged down. There's a couple of things I'll bring out about these genealogies that in general I think are just really good things for good Bible students to know and to understand. In Matthew's account, it begins in Matthew, the 1st chapter, verses 1 through 17. We are given the genealogy in that account from starting with Abraham and bringing us forward into the days of Jesus Christ. Abraham beginning with Isaac, then Isaac, Jacob, Judah and his brothers, and it continues on. There are 3 groups of names that are given in Matthew's genealogy. Each group has 14 names in it. We're going to look at the comparisons of the 2 genealogies in just a minute. There are a couple of things that are really interesting about the genealogies that are given in Matthew and Luke. David they're both in the lineage of David, which was quite important for the Jews, particularly to know. The genealogies are exactly the same from Abraham to David in the 2 accounts. The genealogy given in the book of Matthew brings us through to Jesus through Joseph. The genealogy in the book of Luke brings us from Mary, or from Jesus really, through Mary, all the way back to Adam. Creation, written to the Gentiles, takes us back to that common ground. Where it would have mattered to the Jews that Jesus came from the lineage of Abraham, that the beginning point was that father of that great covenant of theirs. Matthew provides us with that information through the father, Joseph. Zerubbabel is the same as the name that is given in both accounts after David, after the days of David. It could be that it looks like that they cross. It's probably true that, and many would agree, or many think that certainly Joseph and Zacharias and Elizabeth were related, and even if maybe distantly cousins or second cousins, that would have been an extremely common thing to be the case. And so obviously both from priestly families, and so it is interesting to think about those things. So as you go through these genealogies, certainly there are different numbers of generations given in the 2 genealogies, but the keys are the fact that both lead us to David, both have David in their genealogies, and that there seems to be some crossing of families within the genealogies. Probably most effective knowledge for those of us who are studying the Gospels for the reason of Jesus is that, and understanding who the Gospel writers are, is that Matthew brings those Jews to the understanding that he is from the seed of Abraham, that he is from the lineage of David, and that he does come through that in that way. So, and like I said, both genealogies agree completely from David to Abraham, or vice versa, from Abraham to David. But there are some common names, like we said, Zerubbabel being one of those where they seem to cross. The lineage so I'm not going to read these for a number of reasons. I would stumble over some of the names, but I also think that it's information that, especially if you're just listening, is not necessarily something that would matter to you. We'll bring out a few points about some of these people within these genealogies at a later date and as we go through the Gospels. But obviously from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, then it comes through Boaz and Obed to David in both accounts. And then you've got Solomon to Rehoboam, Abijah, and it goes on through, like I said, in Matthew. There's a couple of things that are interesting for the Jewish audience, and we'll talk about those in the next slide, that would have been interesting as far as that they would have been familiar with these names. They would have probably memorized these names. These would be names that would be recalled to their memory. And so those are really important things to think about as Matthew writes to that Jewish audience. Okay, so let's go on to Luke now. Luke gives us, he starts with Jesus, whereas Matthew started with Abraham and comes forward. Luke starts with Jesus. He's going to start with Jesus for those Gentiles, and he's going to say, this is who Jesus was. And he traces us all the way back through to Adam, which of course is our commonality. It is our common ground with Jesus. Jesus began his ministry about 30 years of age. Luke tells us right off the bat, we'll be told in other gospel messages that as well. He is the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, Mary's father. So we're now switching over to Mary. And of course, Joseph's listed because the man is listed, but this genealogy is Mary's genealogy. This is not Joseph's genealogy. This is Mary's. He takes us back through Zerubbabel, as did Joseph's genealogy. They hit common ground there. Mary more than likely are descendants of different brothers, different branches of that same family at that particular moment in time. Back through the son of Nathan to David, and then of course all the way back to Abraham, which appears to be the same. And then he traces us all the way back then to Adam. And so what is certain about the genealogies is that they are both bring the New Testament and the Old Testament together. They draw those lineage lines from the Old Testament to bring us into the New Testament. And they give us, and those who were there at that time and needed this assurance, the assurance and the understanding that we have found the Christ, that this is who we are talking about. Both of these gospel messengers for us provide us with the information that allows us to know that, yes, indeed, this is the one prophesied. He did come through the lineage of David. He is from the tribe of Judah. He is from the seed of David. Through the promise of Abraham, he has come. He is the fulfillment of that. And that is what lineages and these lineages did. One did it for the Jewish audience. The other did it for the Greek and Gentile audience, such as ourselves. He is who he said he was. He is who God had intended him to be. He came the way that he was supposed to. Now, just for a comparison, and just so we have this is sort of the genealogy comparison of these two different genealogies. As we said, this is a great when I taught this class here in Jacksonville, this was one of the charts I handed out. You'll have it now on your slides from this class. But here's the two genealogies given in the gospel messages, Matthew and Luke. Matthew's comes through Joseph, like we said. Luke's comes through the lineage of Mary. We noted already that in Matthew, it traces the line from Abraham to Jesus, and in Luke, it traces the line backwards from Jesus to Adam. There are 42 generations included in Matthew's account, and there are 66 generations included in Luke's. Obviously, Luke's takes us back to Adam, and so there are more generations that are accounted for there. In the book of Matthew, the genealogy is really a prologue. It's a proclamation of the gospel to the Jews. It sort of gives that what they already know. In in Luke, the genealogy follows this account from the baptism of Jesus as a universal interest. He gives us the information that Jesus, when he came to the river to see John the Baptist and was baptized and he began this ministry, this is who he is. This universal interest in this Messiah who has come to seek and to save the lost, not just of the Jewish audience, but to all those who would be saved. Matthew's, as we said, is divided into three different groups: Abraham to David, David to Babylon, and captivity to Christ. And that's kind of the way that is given. And as I said before, there were 14 names in each group, 14 generations in each group. Now, the 14 names in each group were in Matthew's account, were the patriarchs, the kings, and they were private citizens, but they were easily memorized names from the Jews. The Jews would have had the names in this genealogy listed in Matthew. These Jewish people would have known these names. They would have had these names seared and memorized within their heads. They may have had songs like we do, for our judges and our apostles. They knew these names. This was important for the Jewish audience. Now, the genealogy given in the book of Luke agrees with Matthew's genealogy from Abraham to David, as we said, but it's different from David to Joseph. And of course, it's traced to Joseph through Mary. And so Eli is most likely the father of Mary, or Heli, and Luke affirms that Mary too was from the line of David in his gospel. So it's not just Joseph who was from the line of David, but Mary, the virgin who gave birth to deity, was also from that line. And so those are just some of the things that we look at that we're as we make this comparison of these two genealogies. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. I think that we could go through each and every name. We could trace them back. We could look at who they all were. But as for the importance of that for our gospel study, I think what we've brought out really are the key notes to that. Whatever view may be taken, this is Alfred Edersheim, a wonderful Jewish historian who I will use a lot in this class. He actually is a really interesting study himself. He was a Jewish historian who was converted to Jesus Christ. And when he was converted to Jesus and converted to the body of Christ, he realized that Christians knew very little about the Old Testament and the Old Law, that they understood very little about the practices of the feast and the festivals and the things that were happening that were written within the New Testament for Christians to be convinced and convicted. And so he writes some beautiful history. I use his book. I love his book on on temple worship, and I'll use that quite a bit. And I'll tell you when I'm using that. I think I mentioned in maybe last class of his book on Jesus the Messiah, the condensed version. It's a wonderful, wonderful book that I've read throughout my life as a Christian, and has brought me a lot of understanding on just what might be happening, the smells, the feelings, the things that would have been happening during the days of Jesus. And it makes the gospel messages come alive. Alfred Edersheim says here of these two genealogies, whatever view may be taken of the genealogies in the Gospels according to Matthew and Luke, there can be no question that both Joseph and Mary were of the royal lineage of David. Most probably the two were nearly related. While Mary could also claim kinship with the priesthood, being no doubt on her mother's side a blood relative of Elizabeth, the priest wife of Zacharias. And so that's who Mary was, just from her lineage, and that's who Joseph was from his. And so it is interesting that both of them came from the tribe of Judah, can be traced back to David, the king, who the Israelites were waiting to produce this heir, this Messiah. Luke 1, then, chronologically as we continue, Luke 1, verses 5 through 7 are our next in chronological order. Now, remember, we looked at those beginning verses of Luke, which were not really part of the chronological order of the gospel and the messages of the gospel, but they were Luke telling us about himself. So we looked at that last class when we looked at the gospel writers. We've taken a look at John as he began his, saying this didn't just begin here. This wasn't just about this man, this young baby this baby who was born to Mary. This was about deity from eternity, the creator coming in the flesh. And so now we're beginning to look at the first historical chronological information that were given within the gospel messages. In Luke 1, verses 5 through 7, it says, and there was in the days of Herod, so we're given a time frame, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. It's just a beautiful passage for so many reasons. And in fact, I had not planned on doing this, but let me grab my book here, because I'm going to read again of what we read last week about these multitudes and who these people were that were being read about during this particular time, and who Elizabeth and Zacharias would have been, what they would have been a part of. All right, so Luke begins his narrative with the earliest dating possibilities we have for the gospel message. There are other points of reference to secular kings and Roman rulers that we can then put time frames into, but of course this gives us a pretty good idea. During the days of Herod the Great, if you haven't had an opportunity yet to go back and listen to the Between the Testaments classes that are recorded and given here on the Shared Inheritance website, you may want to do that. Herod, it was an interesting figure himself. How he began and became king is interesting. And the reason why the Jews never felt that he was the rightful king is because he wasn't. He was not the rightful heir to the Jewish throne, to the nation of Israel. But it was during his days that Zacharias and Elizabeth were living in this Judean and Galilean area. And we discussed at length about that. He was an Edomite. We talked about that, from a descendant of the Edomites, and that would have been certainly not from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but from Esau. He was a king that was able to become king via help from both the Roman seated people, but more importantly, really, even Cleopatra, Anthony, Octavian. It's a really interesting study in and of itself. He kind of positions himself to gain this throne, and they made sure that he ruled. We're at the end of his reign. He's towards the end of his reign. He's growing very paranoid. He will be the one that'll be responsible for the Bethlehem deaths of the babies there. He becomes very paranoid. And it's about 5 or 6 years before he dies that Zacharias and Elizabeth are given to us in our text here. Luke reminds us and his audience that much has taken place over the 400 years. He starts off by telling us what we've just studied in Between the Testaments, and that is lots of things have changed. Lots of things have changed. There's not a rightful Jewish heir on the throne any longer. The priesthood is certainly not what it was supposed to be at this point, and that there's no longer of the family of David someone who is on the throne in this time. 400 years have passed and a lot of things have happened. The family of David would need to rise again. Somebody was going to have to come to rescue, to a savior, somebody who would deliver this nation, because they were in a mess. It was a mess at this point. And certainly the Jews knew that. And there was not a resemblance at this point of the Judah of old. And once again, we're reminded that earthly kingdoms and earthly worlds have absolutely no consequences at all to the spiritual kingdom of God. And that's important for us to remember, ladies. We need to remember that as we live our lives, that that God's laws and God's providence continues on, and that what transpired during the days in between the testaments and the rulers and all the jockeying for position, God was watching. And the family of Herod and the Roman rulers had been appointed, but it was inconsequential to the plan of God. None of that mattered. None of that meant anything. It was Zacharias and it was Elizabeth who were among those in the nation, the multitudes, as we discussed, the Simeons and the Annas, who were looking for the Messiah of Israel. I'll read this again in case you weren't able to join us for the Between the Testaments and you haven't gone back. But the multitudes, it talks about how when you count up to 6,000 Pharisees and 4,000 Essenes and a smaller number of the other sects, which would have been the Sadducees and the Zealots, that when you think about that, in the time of Palestine, in the days of Christ, it becomes evident that the great mass of Jews did not belong to any of these sects. They were constantly called the multitudes in the New Testament. Frequent references to them contrasting the publicans and the Pharisees might give the impression that all the people either belong to one or the other of those groups. But that is not true. It is not true. The mass of people who found it impossible to keep the strict regulations of the Pharisees and had grown disgusted with the Sadducees. Remember, the Sadducees, they ruled the temple. They were the temple tax folks. They were the ones they were the largest majority of the Sanhedrin. They were the ruling class. They were the aristocrats. They were the rich. They were the ones that these people had become disillusioned with. This number of multitudes were eager for some great religious movement like John the Baptist would start, which would open the doors for them and make it possible for them to enter. And so this helps explain the general response of the call of John the Baptist. Among the masses were the devout men and women like Simeon and Anna and Joseph and Mary and Zacharias and Elizabeth, those people who belonged to none of the sects of the Jews, but were spiritual and saintly. They were anxiously awaiting the coming of the Messiah. It is these people that we see in Zacharias and Elizabeth. Zacharias is a priest in the division of Abijah, a course of Abiah from the family of Aaron. These courses are named in 1 Chronicles 24:10. I'm not going to go back and read that. That is also a list of names, but that is the bands that David, in the days of David, when the family of Aaron had grown so large, so very large, David oversees this division of priest. And it is the division that is noted here to be Zacharias' division. And so after the days of captivity, we've talked about that. We talked about that in Between the Testaments as well. And I like to talk about those days of captivity because so many things happen. But when they come back into Jerusalem, as you remember, they couldn't find enough priests. They had to go out and look for priests to come in. So many of the priest families had been lost in captivity. So when they return, they go out and they look for a priest, but they also allow other families to take on the names of these priestly names and these priestly bands of priests to retain those bands for David as he has named them. Elizabeth, too, is the same name as Aaron's wife, by the way. Aaron had a wife, and you can read about that in Exodus 6:23, named Elizabeth. And she was from the family of Aaron. And of course, as we know, she also it's so important who the officiating priest married. It would have been essential for him to have also been married into a priestly family, Zacharias, in order for the lot to fall on him and him to be able to be given the duty that he was given on the day that he finds out about John. Zacharias and Elizabeth were religious. They were religious not only in action, and not only in words, but in deeds. They had an evidence of their faithfulness. And that is clear here. And it's not an evidence to necessarily a nation, but to God that is clear for us. They talked and they walked like they believed in the God of Israel. When the Greeks ruled, and when now the Romans rule, in the physical land. Zacharias and Elizabeth are part of a people, a multitude of people who remain godly and righteous. We are told that in this verse, which is a wonderful thing for us to know after those 400 years of silence. There have been very few, if any, miracles during that time. We talk about how even in Jesus, late in Jesus's ministry, before he goes back into Jerusalem, those in Perea say, listen, we never saw John doing it. John the Baptist didn't do signs and wonders like Jesus did. And so they were waiting for someone like Jesus to come. And so it's a wonderful way for us to begin our discussion of the Gospels. After we've struggled with these years between Ezra reading the law at the end of the Old Testament until now. There have been some dark and horrible periods. And they've left us knowing that a lot of bad things had happened in order that the faithful may fall away. But now in Luke, we're told, no, wait. There are people waiting. And so we're left knowing that the faithful continued in the day-to-day life that reflected true righteousness. Even when the rulers of the very land that they live in did not understand. And even when the appointed high priest was no longer a priest that would have been a priest that would have been authorized by God. It worries me sometimes to hear Christian brothers and sisters in all lands talk about as if there's despair about what is happening in politics throughout the land and throughout the world. Do you know that never will a discussion be made in the palaces or in the stately buildings of my land or any other land that will change who I am? Or I pray who my children are, or who my grandchildren are, or who my great-grandchildren will be. So here, at the very beginning, after leaving a nation determined to come back in the Old Testament, 400 years later, finding that indeed some have continued on that path, faithfully walking in a path that has been laid by the ordinances and the precepts of God. It's what we all do. A president, a senator, that doesn't change who I am, who I know that I am, who I am known to be, or even anything about my God. Even what I know about him is not changed by what some powerful ruler says. He doesn't change anything. They don't change anything about me. Those rulers do not change me. And Ptolemy and Aristobulus and Caesar and Augustus and Herod and Antipas and all those that we studied about in between the Testaments, they had not changed the faithful multitudes in Jerusalem and throughout Judea and Perea and even throughout the world. Nobody had changed. And for that matter, neither had the Pharisees and the Sadducees changed these people. I mean, you talk about those rulers of their own nation who had been swayed and had changed and had held to the Roman rule. Not even those leaders changed these faithful hearts. I'm just going to briefly talk about the priesthood itself and where all these things happen. Now, when I taught this class here in Jacksonville, we actually had maps. And I have to tell you, I am a huge believer in looking at a map. I don't think that's just because I've traveled. I think it's because it gives you perspective. Maps and depictions of cities help us see this stuff. Edersheim tells us that the number of priests to be found at all times in Jerusalem must have been very great. Just the daily run of temple duties required hundreds or thousands of priests. In general, the priesthood lived in this area outside of the temple, just you remember the temple faced east towards the Mount of Olives and towards Bethany, which was part of the hill country where a lot of the priests lived. And so if you go south of the temple in Jerusalem, there was Ophel. So Ophel was an area, it's the old Jerusalem at this point, where really the priests lived in this area just south of the temple. A lot of priests lived there. According to Jewish tradition, half of each of the 24 courses into which the priests were divided were permanently living in Jerusalem during the days of Jesus. And so there would have been a lot of priests living in this southern area that kind of comes off. If you look at the picture on the slides, the Pool of Siloam, Salome is that big kind of pool looking area off to the looking at the picture off to the left. It would have been west of Ophel. But that area there south of the temple would have been heavily populated by Jews, and particularly by the priest. Now, we know that Zacharias and Elizabeth lived in the hill country. Hill country was considered to be Bethany area, all the way over to Bethlehem, that area east and southeast of Jerusalem. Bethany, we know Jesus stayed with Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Bethany. It was a 20, 30-minute walk for him to come back and forth into Jerusalem to the temple, back and forth. A lot of priests would have lived in Bethany. A lot written about whether or not Zacharias and Elizabeth might have lived in Bethany. But I think it's interesting to look at these maps and to understand where things are in relation to Jerusalem. They lived southeast of Jerusalem in the hill country of Judea. And so that's where they lived. We know that. So anywhere from Bethany, just south of there, through the valley there to the east of Jerusalem. You could walk, like I said, easily through the Mount of Olives. I think at times when it says that Jesus left and went to the Mount of Olives, I don't think he spent the night in the Mount of Olives. I don't think he spent the night outside all the time. I think he actually probably stayed with his disciples, more than likely Mary and Martha, while he was visiting Jerusalem. It would have been a fairly easy walk in those days for him to take those. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just think these are interesting facts about the Gospels. Okay, so lots of priests lived in this area. But remember, there would have been priestly families living elsewhere. Also, remember the family of Onias. If you listen to the Between the Testaments, Onias was the last of the real lineage of Aaron that had been part of the high priesthood. They had been run off during those 400 years. They now live in Egypt. And so they're living over in Egypt. There would have been a lot of high priestly and priestly families that they were the ones that kind of held on during the years of the Maccabees. But that there would have been others living outside of this area. A lot of priests lived in Galilee. In fact, Nazareth, we'll study later and look at later, Nazareth actually was kind of a city called a priestly city where when the priest bands were called in from Galilee, they would have gathered there in Nazareth and journeyed down to Galilee together. Remember, bands of priests rotated in and out of the temple on a weekly basis. And so bands would have been called in at different times. And we'll look at those things as we go through the harmony of the Gospels. We're going to talk about the duties within the temple and what the priests would have done when they came in and what all of this would have looked like. That's who Zacharias was. He had been called in twice a year. He would have gone in for his week within the temple to perform the priestly duties. He was not a high priest, but a priest who was acted as one of the bands of families who did participate in the holy duties of the temple, not just a Levite, but one who was given those duties. All right. So of the 24 bands that would daily minister in the temple in the days of Jesus, there were many of these who would have been outside of this area in Judea and in Galilee. About half of the one half living outside of Jerusalem were settled in Jericho, it is thought. Edersheim writes about that, and these provided much support for the ones in Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember, but the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan, they're on that one who's coming out of Jerusalem, probably is coming from temple duties out and going out towards Jericho. He's on that road. Anyway, it would have been a well-traveled road by priests and Levites during those days. All right, one of the ones who comes upon him, who comes upon him is a priest, and one is a Levite. And this would have been a well-traveled road for the priest and the Levites coming in and out of Jerusalem, because the priest in Jerusalem needed that support. And so a lot of them lived in that area. I just think it's interesting. I hope you do too. Here's a great depiction of what Jerusalem looked like or felt like at that time. Under Herod's rule, of course, Herod expands. It's Herod the Great who expands the temple so much. We talked about that in Between the Testaments. He really wanted to appease the Jews. He wanted to make them like him. And so he expands. But if you look at the picture on the left of the slide, it shows you a neat way to look at the old city of David, which is also oakful, and down to the pool of Siloam. And we'll look at that later on when we look at that, the healing at the pool of Siloam. Anyway, you can see that area that goes south. Remember, it faces east. The temple faced east, like the tabernacle faced east. And you see where the Mount of Olives is there. And the Essens would have lived down in that Essen quarter, and then the lower city. And the upper city is where the high priest would have lived. And we'll look at that in the last week of Jesus's life. But all of this is just so very interesting, I think. I will say this at the beginning, and we'll talk about this later on. During the days of Jesus, the temple was constantly under construction, always under construction. In fact, it is not thought that the temple was really fully built until about 68 AD, 2 years before it is destroyed. And so it is interesting to think about. Also, remember that the fortress of Antonio sat there. If you look at the depiction there, it sits on that northwestern corner of the temple wall. That's where the Roman rule and garrison was all throughout the days of Jesus. So you see how very distorted the temple has become at the days when Jesus comes into the world. Another look at the city of Jerusalem on the right-hand side. I hope you enjoy these slides. I think that it really is helpful in our look. These are just cities that I ask our class here to identify. If you are at home and you are looking at these slides and you are trying to get a good map. Get a good map. There may be a good map in the back of your Bible, and look at these particular places. See where Galilee is in relation to Judea and Jerusalem, and look and see where Samaria, which we talked about in Between the Testaments, always going to be a hard play in the gospel messages. And so that take a good look at where Samaria is, how close to Samaria Jericho is. Perea and Galilee, and Gilead, Perea being the eastern part. John the Baptist spends a lot of days and a lot of time over on that eastern side of the Jordan River. Jesus's last days before he comes back into Jerusalem before his death the last few months are spent in this Perea area and Judea area. And so get familiar with where these boundaries are and where these borders are as we go through the Gospels. I asked my class here to look and to make sure they understood where Jerusalem, Jericho, Bethany, Bethlehem, and Nazareth are for the classes as of this particular period. We'll go forward and we'll identify those Galilean cities, but get familiar with these texts and with the maps and where these things are. It makes the gospel message much more real to you when you understand where things are and how they fit in to the gospel messages. All right, So just before we leave our class today, we'll just look at who Zacharias and Elizabeth were from our text today. Well, for the most part, what we know of them is they've been married for some time. They're older in age, and that they are not able to have children. You know, for the most part, for most people, bearing children is just a natural occurrence. Even to those who don't know God, in most cases, children are conceived and born fairly easily. And perhaps that's why it can be forgotten, even for us, that children are a heritage of the Lord. We lose that concept because not all parents raise their children in the Lord. You know, Psalm 17, around verse 14, and Job 21, beginning in verse 11, they really are interesting passages that talk about how men in the world are full of children. People have children all the time. And they don't raise their children up in the Lord. And those are passages that discuss that. And they bring them up without the Lord. And those are just common occurrences in our world. But make no mistake about it, there's never been a time or a place that the inability for one to have a child is not a sadness. Even for those who don't realize that children are a heritage of the Lord, there's sadness that comes with that, because everybody, in most cases, is able to have children. But that was not so with Zacharias and Elizabeth, and it may not be so with some of you who are listening. It certainly has not been so in my life with all of the family in my life. That is why I have 2 grandchildren from Ethiopia. What a wonderful blessing. And believe me, you understand that those children are given as a heritage to the Lord when you struggle with this particular thing. And our lives are not designed by us always, are they? And immediately, as the curtains open to us on the life of Jesus, we are reminded of that very thing. Elizabeth and Zacharias' lives were not designed by them. They did not dictate the circumstances of their life, and we are told that immediately. That while we only have one verse that tells us about this fact here, I'm certain that this very fact had been the second most important factor in their relationship, aside from God. Isn't that something? Years of this particular situation had weighed heavy on them. And what a sadness that they were barren. And that's what Luke indicates for us. And what grieving must have been required by Zacharias and Elizabeth for this very thing. I can't imagine that that's not the case, especially in the way that we are told this. And God saw this righteous and faithful couple, and through them would come the messenger of the Messiah. God is so good. What a wonderful couple we find here. They had together faced quite possibly the saddest situation a married couple can have. And they are described above many who have children as those who were walking righteously and faithfully, though their life had been saddened in many ways. It was the definition of their union, my guess is it was the definition of their own characters and their own lives. that the external circumstances of their life had not computed into what it was that they had devoted themselves to. The dedication that they had to God had not been changed by this sadness of this external circumstance of their lives. And they did not dwell on it, but they served, and they continued to serve year after year and day after day as those who thought only of God above all else. I'm going to tell you something. If you are wallowing in the pity for yourself, you look at Elizabeth and Zacharias and what they had given and what they had done in spite of the sadness that had been given to them. And do you know that the tragedies and the unforeseen circumstances many, many times drive our relationships off the cliff? It drives our relationships to one another, to our husbands, to our spouses, to our children off of cliffs. And it drives our relationship to God, to a place where we are separated from the very one who allows us the liberty to know that it is not the circumstances of this world that provide us with peace and happiness, but only the relationship that we have with him. And I am convinced that in resolve together, they had determined that if God would intervene, then they would have a child. But if not, they would remain faithful and righteous and loving. And so God heard. And he answered in a way that provided them with an understanding that they would be able to have a child. God hears our prayers, and we'll discuss that in a later class. And the only possible thing we can get from these first few verses of the gospel messages is that our only reasonable response when we find ourselves with life's and external circumstances that we did not anticipate and that we do not understand is that we remain resolved in our faith, that we understand that there is hope, that there is hope beyond, that the fleshly circumstances of our lives are but for a moment, and that there are so many blessings and pleasures and happiness, things of sources of happiness that come without what we tend to fixate upon. We got to pull ourselves out of that hole. And so immediately Luke allows us to be a part of the life of this couple who for many years has dealt with the sadness and remained devoted, dedicated, righteous. We see with the celebration of their son, they have many friends. There are those who are happy and exuberant for them because they have been the kind of people that they needed to be. Don't dwell on your external circumstances, I'm telling you. So right away, the gospel messages provide us with great stability for our lives. We're going to continue on looking at Zacharias, Elizabeth, that day in the temple in our next class.